He's already China's most powerful president in decades. So why does Xi Jinping seem to be tightening the screws even further? Of late, there's been a flurry of strongman measures. There's the treatment of Nobel Peace Laureate Liu Xiaobo during his dying days, the international community voicing concern now over the whereabouts of his wife, poetess Liu Xia. This last Friday's sidelining of 4 Hong Kong legislators on the heels of President Xi's visit to the territory, raising fresh doubts over the former British colony's special status, tighter controls over the internet, with reports last week that the country's 3 main telecoms companies have been ordered to stamp out virtual private networks, VPNs, that help users bypass the so-called Great Firewall of China. The government denies, but already social media seems on an even closer watch. And now comes the purge of a rising star within the Communist Party. Why was 53-year-old Sun Zhenkai removed as leader of the sprawling southwestern metropolis of Chongqing? All this ahead of a crucial congress of the party in the fall, where a large part of the Politburo is expected to be renewed. What is going on in the high halls of power? Some even wonder aloud if Xi Jinping has designs to stay on beyond the customary 2 terms as president. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the tightening of the screws of late in China. We'll be joined from Princeton, New Jersey by exiled human rights attorney Teng Biao, who is with the U.S. Asia Institute. Here in the studio, former Beijing correspondent for newspaper Libération, Pierre Aski, president of Reporters Without Borders.
Hello.
Nice to see you again. We're also joined again by investor Andre Lozekrug-Pietri, who chalks up the air miles between China and France, and has done so for the past decade and seen the change there. Thank you for joining us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. A fall from grace can indeed be dramatic. Last Wednesday, Canada's trade minister was tweeting her a great pleasure at being received, along with that nation's governor general, by the boss of Chongqing. Little did Bardish Chagger know that her host was about to be suspended. The South China Morning Post quotes an unnamed source in that sprawling city of 30 million as saying Sun Zhenkai is suspected of, quote, serious violation of party discipline. Pierre Aski, what do you make of this story?
It's a big story because Sun Zhenkai was one of the possible successors to Xi Jinping. His name was mentioned regularly, and his fall just a few months before the party congress showed that big maneuvers are underway to prepare for the Congress. And it also comes on the eve, there's a ritual in China. Every year in August, the leadership goes to the beach. And they go to Beidahe, which is the nearest seashore to Beijing. And they are beyond the sight of anyone. There's a compound of villas, and they prepare for the big political decisions. That's where everything is being decided. Then you're going to have the Congress a couple of months later. So the removal of one key element from the Politburo and one of the contenders to succession show that not everything is settled and is quiet in the corridors of power. Although we don't know, we must admit, that we don't know what's going on behind the walls of power. This is one of the most secret places on earth. Probably North Korea is worse. But in terms of the party games, we don't know. But there is a context, and the context is the very powerful anti-corruption drive that has been going on for years, which has mostly affected other clans, not so much the president's clan. Then you have the removal of Sun in Chongqing in the context of accusations from abroad. There's a crisis, there's a simmering crisis for the past few months. There's a billionaire exiled in the US, Guo Wenjing, who has made very strong accusations against the key man in Xi Jinping's entourage, called Wang Qishan. He is the boss of the anti-corruption fight. And Wang Qishan is reaching age limit. So normally he should be out in the next party congress. And everybody says in China, whether it's true or not, that Xi Jinping wants to keep him despite party rules. So you have this very strong maneuvering in the background in preparation for this Congress. But to make it short, Xi Jinping is already powerful, and he wants to be even more powerful and clean the floor from potential critics or rivals.
Now, Chongqing is this town in the southwest of China that's become this sort of poster child for everything that's vibrant and change. It's a very dynamic place.
But it's also a key place for political drama in China.
Yes. Because there was the spectacular downfall of Bo Xilai.
Yes. Chongqing, first of all, is a huge city. I mean, the metropolis is about 30 million people. The town itself is sprawling. You cannot even imagine the limits of the city. So it is something very important on the Yangtze River. And the boss of Chongqing is a heavyweight in Chinese politics. So Bo Xilai had made it his powerhouse. Bo Xilai was a rival to Xi Jinping for one very good reason. Both of them are sons of key leaders during the Mao era. And Bo Xilai thought that his father was more important than Xi Jinping's father in history. And he thought that the number one job should have gone to him. And suddenly, a few months before the change of power, Bo Xilai fell. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. His wife is also sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of a British citizen. And all of a sudden, you have a huge chunk of the party leadership that falls, and some allies fall in the following weeks or months. So that's Chongqing. And 5 years later, once again, the boss of Chongqing, who is a contender for a top power, falls. You have to think.
Some are saying it's not a coincidence that there's something about Chongqing.
I don't know if it's something about Chongqing. It's the fact that the boss of Chongqing, he is by nature an important man because this is a key city in China's landscape.
André Lezecoq-Pietri?
Yeah, maybe to add to what Pierre just said, Chongqing, like Tianjin, are the two cities who are basically city-states. So they are provinces in themselves, so the power is very important. But you're totally right. There seems to be a curse about Chongqing. There is a relationship, actually, is that Wang Qishan that was just mentioned, which is basically the anti-corruption Tsar, has mentioned a couple of months ago that he was not happy that Bo Xilai's allies have not been removed fast enough. And it's true that the last people who were in the entourage of Bo Xilai were removed of their posts last December or even one last June. So that was maybe, is this a major reason? Is this a pretext? What is sure is I think this is going to give fantastic material for people who want to do a Chinese version of House of Cards, because that's basically what's unraveling here. What is particularly interesting is that it seems that this succession, I mean, in next October, we will have this party congress. It will be particularly important because it will be the second term of Xi Jinping, most probably. And in these second terms, you determine who is going to be the successor. A lot of observers seem to say in the last couple of months, Xi has accumulated so much power than nobody else except Deng Xiaoping or Mao before, and that no more factions are existing. I mean, the consensus-based leadership, which was Hu Jintao's kind of characteristic, is not anymore. There's a clear line of command. It may actually not be as clear as that. And what has been said is the most accurate is nobody really knows what's unraveling, but there's definitely still unclarity.
To show what is at stake, the succession has been designed by Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping in 1989, when there was the Tiananmen Square massacre and repression, Deng Xiaoping was a retired leader, but he had authority on major decisions. And so he fired the party leader of that time, Zhao Ziyang, and he decided on the two next leaders. He chose Jiang Zemin to be the boss for the next 2 terms. And he already decided in 1989 that Hu Jintao would succeed, would be the next generation leader after Jiang Zemin. And that has worked pretty well. There were some tensions, but it worked pretty well, and that line of succession was guaranteed. Then came Xi Jinping, and it also was quite a smooth handover of power. And now we are in a situation where nobody knows, because normally in 3 months' time at the party congress, they should announce, or it should be clear at least, who the successor should be 5 years later. To give him time to prepare, he will have, a smooth transition, learning the ropes of power, making his own network, and so on. And that is not clear at all, particularly after the downfall of the Chongqing boss.
Could Xi Jinping hang on and be a 3-term president?
This would be, first of all, unprecedented, since those rules of succession have been established by Deng Xiaoping. And secondly, it would be imposed on the party by Xi Jinping's clan, and it would not be, or it would be requested by the people because Xi Jinping is indeed popular and has made his grip on authority. But certainly it would be a very spectacular change in Chinese politics.
A spectacular change, André Lozakrug-Pietri, because you have to think that it's an authoritarian state. We're going to talk about it more in detail in a moment. But nonetheless, there are these rules for smooth transition, and this would really change the nature of China and the way it's ruled, wouldn't it?
Well, look, I would say the politics that is always going on in the months before party congress is also a way for the party to show, yes, it's a one-party state, but inside this party, there's always this kind of some people call it comedy, some people call it true politics, jockeying for the top power. And there is internal democracy. You can have your own opinion about that or not. And maybe what is happening is also to show maybe to a lot of either opponents or supporters of Xi Jinping that nothing is done and that everybody needs to deserve its post. And I cannot help making the relationship that we just got pretty good news on the economic front. A lot of people were predicting since years a very hard landing. And here suddenly you have this
6.9% growth.
6.9%.
Do you believe the numbers? Because there's always people who question the numbers.
Yes, but people were questioning the numbers when they were at 10% because people think that it was actually way higher, and probably it went also way lower than the famous 6.5% of this year. But what is true is that economic momentum is continuing. What is also true is that it's getting more and more difficult for foreign companies, but that's maybe another story. But here the fact that on an economic track record, China seems to be on track, that they are cutting really very strongly on over leverage. I mean, you saw these famous CEOs doing acquisitions all over the world that are suddenly being either barred from doing that or even imprisoned. For one of them, a famous insurance company boss who was a star 3 months ago, who is now under house arrest. I mean, these things are showing that the leadership seems to be delivering. Maybe this is also giving the leadership some kind of additional political leeway to put its own people in place.
Yeah, but there's still plenty of questions also on the economy when it comes to things like the way that the banks work, the housing bubbles.
Well, there was an article in a famous Chinese journal who is very close to the leadership, which is Global Times, that was talking about the gray rhinos. Gray rhinos, unlike black swans, are actually things which are totally obvious risks.
Gray rhinos.
Gray rhinos, yes. That people actually are not noticing because they become part of and the over-leveraging has been a story in China since 10 or 15 years. Now this seems to be the major risk, and some real action is happening.
There are a lot of stories of animals in the metaphoric sense, because you're talking of rhinos, but in the anti-corruption struggle, people talk of tigers and flies. The tigers are the big, powerful leaders, and the flies are the small cadders. Yeah. So we are in a zoo.
And later we're going to talk about bears as well, by the way. Last Thursday's death of Nobel Peace Laureate Liu Xiaobo raised many questions about what's going on in China, how the 61-year-old human rights activist was treated in prison. He was released from hospital only days before he succumbed to liver cancer. Why the veteran of the Tiananmen Square protests couldn't be treated abroad. Whether the scattering of his ashes at sea was to prevent his gravesite from becoming a shrine for dissidents. And what fate for his wife, the poetess Liu Xia, who was filmed at his funeral, but whose status is unclear after years of house arrest. Pieraski, your thoughts on the passing of Liu Xiaobo and the way Chinese authorities handled his final days?
It's really a sign of how this regime doesn't care about appearances, because they just released him 3 weeks before he died. They announced they were releasing him, but actually he was under very close surveillance in a hospital just to die, because you don't discover a cancer 3 weeks before someone dies. And they haven't answered the question, when did they diagnose this cancer? So the way they handled all this, and the humiliating way the funerals were organized. They claimed that his friends were there, but they were all police and party officials present at the funerals surrounding Liu Xia, who has not been able to say one word freely during that whole period, and has been under house arrest herself since 2010, since he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, although nothing has been, she hasn't been charged of anything and hasn't been judged. It's just because she's the wife of Liu Xiaobo. So all this really shows that this regime is quite ruthless when it comes to dealing with opponents. And someone like Liu Xiaobo is a non-violent intellectual. He hasn't raised an army of terrorists against the Chinese government. He's made a manifesto that was asking for democracy and the rule of law in China. And that is really sending very, very bitter signals to the Chinese society and to the world.
All right, and he's handling a message. We're going to pick up on that point, what you just said, when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the tightening of the screws in China, the apparent purge of a rising star within the Communist Party ahead of a crucial Congress, and also crackdown on dissidents, a tighter leash play on dissidents. And we're talking about it in the company of former correspondent for newspaper Libération Pieraski, now president of Reporters Without Borders, André Lozekrug-Pietri, investor who's been traveling to China for a long time, who's with us as well. We were talking just before the break about Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Peace Laureate, who you met.
Yes, I met him twice when I was based in China. It was difficult to meet him. He was banned from meeting journalists, but he was keen to take risks to get his message across.
Most people in China, of course, unaware of Liu Xiaobo, or at least it's not something that's talked about. One place where they do know his name, though, is Hong Kong. Their pro-democracy activists staged vigils after his death, and the authority in that former British colony paid tribute.
I think Hong Kong people are always very compassionate. And so I share that compassion of many Hong Kong people by sending my condolence to the wife and the family of Mr. Liu.
Now, Carrie Lam spoke after the suspension of 4 pro-democracy lawmakers in Hong Kong. And there's this feeling that perhaps, that special status for the former British colony is endangered.
Well, as you know, Hong Kong is part of the People's Republic of China, but under the one country, two system that was negotiated by the British and the Chinese government. So normally there is full autonomy for Hong Kong, but Hong Kong people have been feeling for the past few years that there is a lot of growing encroachment into that autonomy, whether it's in the judicial system, in the political system. And you will remember that a couple of years ago, there was this big movement initiated by the youth in Hong Kong, asking for direct election of the leader of Hong Kong. And Mrs. Lam that we just saw was appointed or elected on a short list decided by Beijing. So clearly Beijing had refused the demand of the youth back then. And we are now in a very tense and very confrontational, growing confrontation between parts of the Hong Kong population, because Hong Kong is not a completely unified population. Part of it wants to have peaceful and quite accommodating relations with mainland China, and another one wants to express its identity through this struggle for democracy. So it's for direct democracy. So it's a very complex but tense and increasingly tense situation.
Now, one of the attractions of Hong Kong is that it is part of China, but it plays by Western rules. And so it is an attraction for investors. Is there a feeling that could be in doubt or endangered?
Well, what I saw undoubtedly since a couple of years, that Hong Kong in the rise of China, especially since the end of the 90s, early 2000, when this extraordinary economic boom, Hong Kong became extremely attractive because it was a way of putting your head office if you didn't want to do it in the mainland. Since a couple of years, I'm seeing indeed a couple of companies, investors who are a little bit worried about how Hong Kong gets influenced even from an economic point of view of what is decided by China. And the reason is very simple. 20 years ago, Hong Kong was a powerhouse, was not dependent on the mainland for its success. Today, Hong Kong is mainly a hub to invest in China. And so if the Chinese economic boom does not need Hong Kong anymore, and so you can see the power play, which is a characteristic of the Chinese system, is actually working towards the mainland and even more. So you have this split that Pierre mentioned between actually also a very split society from a social point of view. You have a very, very tiny, ultra-wealthy society, mainly real estate tycoons, etc., who obviously want an accommodating policy. And you have the vast majority of people living in, not necessarily in a difficult economic situation, but, it's the most expensive city in the world. And so a lot of people don't make a real great living out there. So you have also this split society.
All right, we were talking about Liu Xiaobo earlier and how much his death is being talked about. A report this week by the University of Toronto's Citizen Lab details how Chinese censors were able to intercept in real time images commemorating Liu in private one-on-one chats on the Chinese service WeChat, a feat that hints at the government's image recognition capabilities. And it's not just, by the way, Liu Xiaobo that's a no-no on social media. So is, it turns out, Winnie the Pooh, whose creator, A.A. Milne, recently passed away. Laurent Berstecker explains why.
It may seem like an innocent montage, yet this picture of Xi Jinping and Winnie the Pooh has been the most censored photograph in China this year. Here, images of the world's most famous cartoon bear have been banned since internet users pointed out its so-called resemblance to the president. It's not the first time Xi Jinping has suffered the comparison. In 2013, this picture was also removed from the internet, and the friendly yellow bear remains a taboo topic for the population.
Political no comment.
You better leave it alone. It's not good for our president.
I think it's cute. It makes him seem friendly.
For others, the comparison is no laughing matter.
You think it's funny to compare our president to this bear? What are you trying to say?
The situation might seem absurd, but it illustrates the rise of censorship in a country where making fun of authority figures is strictly forbidden.
In China, you can only say positive things about the government.
A cult of personality that knows no bound, and which has seen the harmless yellow cartoon bear become an enemy of the state.
Yeah, we're joined at this point by exiled human rights attorney Teng Biao, who's with the U.S. Asia Institute. Thank you for being with us from Princeton, New Jersey.
Thank you for having me.
I'm just going to read to you, Biao, what one academic told the Financial Times about this Winnie the Pooh story. He said, historically, two things have not been allowed: political organizing and political action. But this year, a third has been added to the list: talking about the president. What are your thoughts on what's going on social media in China?
Yeah, the social media, the internet is strictly controlled and censored by the Chinese government. Millions of foreign websites are blocked, even Google, Twitter, and Facebook. Recently, the images of Liu Xiaobo, Liu Xia, and are all filtered, and people just can't send them. And VPNs are forbidden now. So Xi Jinping is tightening the control on internet and social media.
But why does he need to do it? He's already the most powerful president in decades that China has seen. Why does he need to tighten the grip further?
From the viewpoint of the Communist Party, they feel it's necessary to crack down more severely on the civil society, censor more censorship on internet. One reason is more and more Chinese people, citizens, are using the internet to promote the human rights movement, all kinds of activism. And for the past 15 years, especially Chinese human rights lawyers using the internet and the social media and other technologies promoted the rights defense movement, and that was seen as a big threat to the one-party system. And then Xi Jinping issued the harsh crackdown on not only lawyers but bloggers and journalists, media, and underground churches. So and on the other hand, the Communist Party is facing political crisis and as well as financial and social crisis and ideological crisis. So they feel they can't control the civil society, so they need to cut off the internet, to eliminate the human rights movement, the dissenting force from the civil society.
Pierre Aski, Teng Biao talking about political and financial crisis within the Communist Party. You heard André Lozekrug saying 6.9% growth, the country's doing well, the president is strong. How do you explain, cracking down on images of Winnie the Pooh?
All this shows that the insecure feeling that there is in the party leadership for several reasons. One is, indeed, you have a change of economic model. China went from a 10-12% growth with an export model to a much smaller, although still high, growth that is trying to create domestic consumption. There is the international environment, which should not be forgotten. The one thing that Xi Jinping shares with Vladimir Putin is a kind of paranoid view of the world, where China would be surrounded by the Americans, where the US and the West would be trying to infiltrate the civil society to create color revolutions, as they were called in the former Soviet Union. And all this is creating a need and a wish to tighten the grip on power, and particularly towards this civil society. Teng Biao was really part of this group of lawyers that could grow under Hu Jintao, the predecessor of Xi Jinping. We went from when I arrived in China, there were only 2 or 3 lawyers who dared defending human rights victims. when in last 2 years ago, when there was this crackdown, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of them. And so you had some space that was created for the civil society in the past decade that suddenly came to a halt with Xi Jinping. And I think you have to understand one thing: Xi Jinping.
Does that mean there's no pressure valve anymore?
No, very little.
So it's a recipe for disaster, what you're saying.
And the social networks are a little bit still a way for people to express their views. Liu Xiaobo used to call it a gift from God, internet. Now it seems that Xi Jinping wants to close that gift. But you have to remember one thing: Xi Jinping is no Gorbachev. Gorbachev is a dirty word in China, and he is the son of a party leader, and his mission at the head of the party is to keep the party in power. Once you've understood that, you understand everything else in the implementation of this program.
All right, Pieraski, you talk about this worldview that perhaps everybody's out to get you, but just remember that on the day that Liu Xiaobo died, last Thursday, Donald Trump was in Paris. At the joint press conference he gave with Emmanuel Macron, a Chinese journalist asked the U.S. president what he thought of Xi Jinping.
I have great respect for him. We've gotten to know each other very well. A great leader. He's a very talented man. I think he's a very good man. He loves China, I can tell you. He loves China. He wants to do what's right for China.
What do you think of that?
It's a disgraceful statement on that day, but it's no surprise. Donald Trump is probably never heard about Liu Xiaobo, doesn't know a clue about the domestic society and the situation within China, and he's discovered China over dinner.
Emmanuel Macron was also asked what he thought of Xi Jinping, and he didn't mention Liu Xiaobo either.
He put out a tweet just afterwards.
Well, not in the press conference.
But not at the press conference, you're right. But I think this is just, the symbol of the balance of power at the moment between a powerful China and a rising China, still rising, in a world that is more and more chaotic, in which there is no real center, and China is the big winner of the 6 months of Donald Trump. The first move that Donald Trump did was to kill the Trans-Pacific Free Trade Treaty, which was designed by the previous administration to contain China. And that's the first thing that Donald Trump did because he hates free trade treaties, but it was a gift to China. So this is really the background to everything we're talking about.
Teng Biao, what do you make of the way Donald Trump has handled Xi Jinping?
He said Xi Jinping wants to do what's right for China. So Donald Trump, this kind of word is totally unacceptable. And generally, Donald Trump doesn't care about human rights, the freedom, especially freedom and democracy for China. He puts some other things much higher position than human rights. And Xi Jinping, he also called Xi Jinping a respectful leader. I responded to his tweet that I told him Xi Jinping is not a respectful leader, but a brutal dictator, a corrupt official. And he issued the worst crackdown on human rights and since 1989, the Tiananmen massacre. And I really worried about Trump's policy toward China, and that will bring disaster not only to China but also to the rest of the world.
Andrei Luzaku-Pietri, you came on for a previous show when Trump was first elected, and at the time he was bashing Beijing, and you said, well, this is maybe the right strategy if you want to afterwards strike deals with the Chinese. But what do you think when the U.S. president speaks there? And
well, I also mentioned exactly the same, that the removal of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was the best gift that you could give. So the incoherence, I think on one side I see incoherence, but I see big resemblances between the two leaders in one fact, is that they are symbolizing on a political way the kind of the return of powerful nation states, and completely at the backdrop of what we've seen in the last 30 years, which is international orders, international values, international institutions. And when I see that, I mean, I can only reflect on my experience I had in China, which is in the business. I'm an investor, so I'm not going to make any political statements, but even in business, when you're not true to your values and your principles, you are always at a disadvantage towards somebody who is tramping on that. And I think for Europe, I mean, we don't expect a lot from Donald Trump, but from Europe, we expect that we keep some of the values very dear, because if we don't respect them, we're going to have not only political issues, we're going to have economic problems. And it's very interesting to see Germany, which is also a country I know well, which was for 20 years a big benefactor of China because it was basically selling equipment goods that China used to build up its economic miracle, who since a year is becoming extremely worried that actually China is closing down. And it was a little bit ironic. I was in Davos when President Xi made this speech where in front of 3,000 delegates, 2,000 of them had no clue about China. So when he talked about the fact that he is now the hero of globalization, a lot of people applauded, but those who really had experience in China knew that it was some kind of ironic, but that at the moment where actually China is closing down on foreign business. So my interpretation is that Xi Jinping is trying to walk maybe a very Chinese way. That means on a political way, he is really following a very nation-centric policy, which, as Pierre said, does not really care a lot about what the rest of the world say. And it's the responsibility of the world to say we're not going to meddle in your affairs, but we agree or we don't agree. And if we don't say we don't agree, we have a risk. But on an economic way, he just said this morning, or I think yesterday, we still need investment, because he knows, and there are a lot of smart people around him, that he absolutely knows for this transition to a service and to a high-tech economy, he needs foreign investment. And I think this paradox is going to be very problematic for him.
All right. So when you listen, Pierre, to very briefly to what André said just now, and we've been talking this past hour about a government that's on the defensive when it comes to any kind of criticism, Emmanuel Macron has yet to meet Xi Jinping. How should he handle him?
Well, they met in Hamburg,
but not
on the side of the G20. I think he's going to be more careful with Xi Jinping for the same reasons that were mentioned about Germany. That Emmanuel Macron has talked a lot about reciprocity during his campaign, and the problem in the relation with China is the lack of reciprocity. China wants to buy tech companies in Europe, but wouldn't allow a foreign company to buy a tech company in China. And so I think Emmanuel Macron will be very careful in his handling of China. He will not have an idealistic view of China. I think he will be more on a European protection than embracing the China dream.
More in line with the German Chancellor than the U.S. President.
Definitely.
Pierre Aski, I want to thank you. I want to thank André Lozekrug-Pietri. I want to thank Teng Biao for being with us from Princeton, New Jersey. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. Let me say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois.
We mentioned Winnie the Pooh earlier.
Well, I was going to get to that. We already have, it seems. But in any case, we're seeing...
But apparently there's more on that. There was Eeyore as the Japanese Prime Minister.
Right. I mean, censorship online, I guess it's not unusual in China. In any case, I found this piece quite interesting. It just shows how quickly things have changed in one year. It's a piece shared by Eddie Du on Twitter. Chinese media run a long propaganda article talking up Sun Shenkai's achievements. Now, this is about a year ago, so it shows the extent to which things have changed. We're not going to be seeing probably too many more of those propaganda pieces. And this is the headline in today's South China Morning Post, saying that the probe evokes memories of Bo Xilai's dramatic fall. I imagine this has been also a topic of conversation. And a quote from that article: "One felled party boss in less than a decade is understandable, while two becomes an unsettling puzzle." So I suppose we're seeing a trend emerging here that has been picked up by the editorial writers of the South China Morning Post, and also Twitter users sharing those remarks. Now, what toe has he stepped on, asks another Twitter user going by the handle Glass Hippo. "This is how it works in an authoritarian state. Scary." In other words, the rapid change of fortunes for him. This is from Bloomberg Politics on their Twitter account. "The downfall deepens the intrigue ahead of China's Party Congress later this year." So many people trying to understand what's going on behind the scenes, but pretty clearly it is about consolidating the power of Xi Jinping, who has, as this graphic shows, rapidly consolidated that power since the Communist Party's 18th Congress elevated him to General Secretary's post in 2012. He'll preside over the next Congress later this year as its anointed core leader. And you're seeing there him very much at the centre of that power structure. So there you go. That's a look, Francois, at some of the reactions on social media.
And Sun, at the age of 53, was the youngest member of the Politburo. It's still a domain for old men.
You know, China works with generations, and Xi Jinping was the president for the 5th generation, Mao being the first one. And so every 10 years you have a generation coming to power. And so Sun was supposed to be the 6th, or could have been the 6th generation, which interestingly is the first generation that was born or too young to experience the Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping was old enough to have experienced the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution. The next generation in power didn't, and that changes a lot in terms of mentality and view of the world.
Mentality and view of the world. And just one final point on this, Andre, are young people attuned to the history, the Cultural Revolution, that kind of thing? Is this something they talk about?
Well, it is talked in families, obviously, but I kind of agree with the fact that 5 or 10 years ago, there was really a sense of you were able to talk. As soon as you were not precisely criticizing the top leadership, there was a lot of discussion. During the financial crisis, a lot of the leadership was criticized for handling their affairs until 2 years ago when there was a stock market fall. These stories about Cultural Revolution, how harsh it was and how the Chinese generation did not want to come back to this kind of dictatorship was really discussed in small circles. Today, this is obviously what you don't see since a couple of months, and I would say 2-3 years is much more difficult to see that. And you see that in numbers. Out of Beijing, you have people who are emigrating and they don't come back.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. I want to thank you, James.
Thanks.
I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.